So, as you saw, the title of this talk is America's History of Immigration Restrictions. And what I want to do today is take you on a journey through history to understand these immigration restrictions. Because America has changed a lot since the founding, right? It has changed so much throughout history. One fun fact I learned recently was, did you know that back in the 19th century, there used to be 1.5 million pounds of horse manure on the streets of New York City every day? That's crazy. Now we have incredible freeways, clean streets. If you've been to the 405, like 14 lanes, just incredible, right? That's a good change. So we used to have in the 19th century 1 million pounds of horse manure on the street, but we didn't have income tax. I don't know. So that is definitely a bad change, income tax, right? And another bad change that has happened in America is immigration policy. Because I don't know if many people remember that here in America, we used to have, up until the 20th century, essentially open borders. So basically, anyone who wanted to come to America could do so basically unrestricted. And I want to show you the steps that it took to come to the United States back then. Step 1, decide to come to America. Step 2, jump on a boat. Step 3, arrive in America. That's what it took. But since then, things have changed. I'm going to show you what it looks like to come to America legally today. This is what it looks like. I know I couldn't fit the chart in the giant screen, but this is what it looks like to come legally to America today. And because legal immigration looks like this, and for the vast majority of people, it's impossible to immigrate to America legally, then for the rest of the people, coming to America looks like this. We see it all the time. And then, so we have the regulations, right? And then we have the way that people talk about immigration. The immigration debate, which is kind of like the horse manure of today, right? And we have people that are really tribal. There's so much tribalism in this discussion, especially from the anti-immigration side. And you have, for instance, Donald Trump, who said a couple months ago, talking about illegal immigration. They are rough people, in many cases from jails, prisons, from mental institutions, insane asylums. You know, insane asylums, that's Silence of the Lambs stuff. Hannibal Lecter, anybody know Hannibal Lecter? We don't want them in this country. And then you have other people kind of like influencers, right? Like Ann Coulter, who says, and I quote, "Legal immigration is going to destroy this country just as surely as an amnesty for illegal immigrants will." And then she calls to shut down immigration, including legal immigration. No way to get here, not through marriages, not through refugee program, close it entirely. So I think that with this sort of rhetoric going on, I think, and including right from a former president and candidate, suppose, many people, it's really tempting to think, well, with this tribalist rhetoric from people that are actually have a direct influence on policy, then obviously we have this sort of restrictions. Versus the founding of America, right, when everyone seemed to be an individualist, and we had freedom in immigration, essentially. We had open borders. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that. I think tribalism is not enough to explain what has happened and why we have these restrictions today. So, is it true that we're so uniquely collectivist today that we have these restrictions because of our collectivism, versus people back then, when immigration was free, were much more individualist, and that's why they didn't have these restrictions. I'm going to try to help you understand how this work and what has happened throughout history to get to an answer for that. So I think it's helpful to explore the way that people talked about immigration throughout history to understand and try to answer these questions. So back in the founding era, like I said, anyone who wanted to come to America could do so basically unrestricted. But that didn't mean that everyone loved immigrants so much. In fact, there's a lot of people who otherwise had great ideas, but were a little bit collectivistic about immigrants, and they didn't love immigrants. For instance, Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter in 1753, before the founding. And he said, and I quote, "Those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation." He was talking about German immigrants, and then he said other more positive things about them. But that's a little bit how he felt. And then another example, the Federalists. The Federalists didn't love immigrants. They didn't want them involved in political life. So for instance, this letter from William Smith Shaw, who was John Adams' nephew, he wrote in 1798 that the grand cause of all of our present difficulties may be traced to so many hordes of foreigners immigrating to America. And that could have been written today, right? That's kind of like the rhetoric that we have today. So there is, I think, in America, this tension between the founding principles, the individualism, and this collectivism that so many people held, and in their minds, that's how they thought of immigrants. And of course, what else was at tension at this point with freedom and individualism in America? Slavery, right? So America wasn't fully living up to its own founding ideals at this point, to individualism, because we had this horrible racism in slavery that betrayed these principles. But when it comes to immigration, despite some people's dislike of immigrants, it's not that they wanted to keep them out. It's not like Benjamin Franklin wanted to add a section to the Constitution that said the federal government had a role in restricting immigration, right? Even though he thought, immigrants, some of them were like the most stupid sort of their own nation. So the immigrants continued to come into the 1800s, and America was thriving. It went from being kind of like Europe's outpost to being this world economic power. And the anti-immigrant rhetoric did very little or nothing, really, to stop the immigration, because there was no government force involved. And in fact, the Constitution and Declaration were such incredible achievements that word got to Europe, and people wanted to come to America because of that. But also, the collectivism regarding immigration remained, and in fact, it started to grow. And we start seeing the rise of the nativist movement. These people that, because they were born here in America, they thought they had to protect it from these awful foreigners, and the country kind of belongs to them. One example of such a group is the Know Nothing Party. You may have heard about them. And they saw immigrants as disruptors to their traditions and as a threat to them. And throughout history for the nativists, there was many particular groups of immigrants that they hated. But at this point, they really, really disliked the Irish. They disliked the Irish so much that there started being riots, and some of these groups turned really violent, and they started beating people up on the street, and they started burning buildings down. This is a church that was burned in a riot because the Irish were generally Catholics, and they didn't like the Catholics. Now, I don't like the Catholics either a lot, but this is just tribalism, and it was focused on these immigrants. And culturally, we saw things like this back then. This is a cartoon that depicts the Irish, in this case, the Irish priests, as these crocodiles that are going to eat the children of America. And they're this huge threat. They were seen as vermin. And people really, really wanted to stay away from the Irish because they thought they were drunk, like they were prone to being drunk, they were prone to sickness, they were rowdy, they were wild and civilized. This is how they were depicted. And they wanted to stay away from the Irish so much, like, so this is a cartoon like in a newspaper, right? So you open the newspaper, you saw that cartoon, and then you went to the classifieds, and you saw things like this. You started seeing this phrase in a lot of the ads: no Irish need apply. People really, a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people really wanted to stay away from the Irish. But despite this xenophobia, we didn't have any major restriction on immigration. People could still come, the Irish could still come. But soon there would be a new victim to the collectivist, which was going to be the Chinese. The Chinese began arriving in large numbers during the California gold rush. And the Chinese were very different from the Americans, right? They dressed different, they looked different, they spoke a different language. They were kind of like this perfect encapsulation of the other, right? This group that the tribalists and the collectivists really hate and fear. And a lot of people saw them as a threat because they took American jobs and they lowered wages. And a lot of people thought that the Chinese were incapable of assimilating. We started seeing things like this: a movement to stop the Chinese from being here. In fact, the Chinese were deemed an invasion. That rhetoric may sound familiar to you because we hear it today regarding the immigrants from Latin America. And it wasn't just a discussion in the newspapers, like it was really infiltrating the culture, this collectivism against the Chinese. This is an ad for a laundry detergent. And you can see Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese person, and it says at the bottom of it, if you can read it, "The Chinese must go." And it has all sort of, I'm not going to read the racist things that ad says. This is an ad from 1886. So at this point in America, this racism, this xenophobia sells. And it was seen as appropriate, and it was gaining so much steam, this in-group, out-group dynamic. And of course, there were a lot of good things going on in America at that point. And there were people that really liked the immigrant and opposed these sort of things. And that's the element of individualism that was still, that was prominent in America. But we saw things like this. And then it is at this point in history that something shifts. Because this is when America starts to take a turn with immigration regulations. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. In essence, what this legislation did was, this legislation and a couple of successive laws, was ban the Chinese laborers from coming to America. It excluded nearly all Chinese from coming here, unless they fit into some narrow categories like ministers and teachers. So if you were a Chinese person seeking admission to the United States, you had to prove that you fit into these narrow categories. Otherwise, you couldn't come here. And this law identified Chinese people not only by the place of origin, but they identified also by phenotype. So in America, we see this collectivism of differing degrees, the xenophobia up to this point, kind of like since before the founding even. But it doesn't translate into federal regulations on immigration and exclusions until 1882. And the regulations were really focused on the Asians at this point. Because I know what some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I heard about Ellis Island, 1892, and that was a good thing, right? We welcomed immigrants. And it's true. Ellis Island was, for the most part, like a great place. The way that people talk about it, spacious quarters to welcome intending citizens. And a lot of Americans were pro-immigration. They saw the immigrants as individuals. In fact, a lot of them helped immigrants, when they came to Ellis Island, helped them avoid scams and helped them, settle and things like that. But a lot of people don't know that there was another island off the coast of San Francisco, Angel Island, which welcomed the ships coming from the Pacific, who were mostly Asians. And there, it wasn't like Ellis Island where most immigrants got through and were welcomed. There, Asian immigrants were subject to long and detailed interrogations. They were detained and mistreated. In fact, when they were detained, and you can see this to this day, they would carve poems on the walls of the detention center. Poems like this: I clasped my hands in parting with my brothers and classmates. Because of the mouth I hastened to cross the American Ocean. How was I to know that the Western barbarians had lost their hearts and reason? With 100 kinds of oppressive laws, they mistreat us Chinese. So this is how a lot of Americans were treating the Chinese immigrants. But at this point, the problem was the Chinese for these nativists. But the rest of the immigrants were fine. But the Chinese Exclusion Act would be the first, it would give us a clue to what was to come. Because in 1907, the Dillingham Commission was formed. It was a commission that was tasked with producing a report on immigration. And the report provided evidence that the old immigrants were much better than the new immigrants. The new immigrants were much, much worse. The new immigrants being the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the old immigrants being the ones from Western and Northern Europe. The evidence that they presented was just not really evidence. They just made up stuff essentially to fit their conclusion that the new immigrants were somehow worse. By the way, this claim of the new immigrants being worse is made to this day, and Culture makes it about immigrants from 1965 and onwards. And while not everyone favored these restrictions, a lot of people did, and so Congress started exploring new restrictions to immigration. And it formed an immigration committee. And it started listening to pseudoscientists who thought it was time to include an element of eugenics into immigration law. What they wanted to do is preserve the white race. They saw kind of like America as a race. And they saw immigration as a threat to that race, not just to the physical and outward aspects of people, but also they thought that they would ruin the character of America because they thought that race determined their morality, that it determined their willingness to work, that it determined their character entirely. And so after some other legislation, in 1924, Congress passes a landmark legislation in immigration, which was the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the National Origins Act or the Johnson-Reed Act. Very broadly speaking, what this what this legislation did was it set limits or quotas on the number of immigrants allowed from each country. And because of the way it was designed, it immensely favored immigration from Western and Northern European countries. And it restricted the immigration of Southern and Eastern European countries, and it completely banned immigration from Asian Pacific countries. This would be the millions of immigrants that were prevented from coming to America, including the Jewish people escaping the horrors in Europe, is unprecedented at this point. So if you think about it, that really escalated really quickly, because we had, upon the founding and some years after, essentially this freedom in immigration until 1882. When 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act passes, and at this point, the Chinese are barred from coming here, but the rest of the immigrants were okay. But then in the span of those 40 years, we start seeing all this other legislation, and we start seeing that most immigrants were banned from coming here. And that is a very fast, thanks. That was a very fast, very sudden change. So what happened in 1882 and leading all the way up to 1924, that suddenly this tribalism that was kind of like this opinion or this view that some people held kind of privately, even if they put it in the newspaper, how did it go from being that to being like this major force that influenced legislation? If the tribalism was always there, fighting with the individualism in America, as we saw from since before the founding, what happened that it flipped the switch and it became so influential in the legislation? What's responsible for this shift? And the answer is the usual suspect. It's philosophy. At the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century, the intellectuals were the ones pushing collectivism. They were pushing the tribalism. They were pushing racism and xenophobia and eugenics. Thinkers who were popular at that time included Herbert Spencer with his social Darwinism. Here's a newspaper clipping from when he died, described as one of the greatest thinkers of his time. Madison Grant, a notorious eugenicist. Here's a review, a lengthy review of his book, Passing of the Great Race in 1916. And also Friedrich Hegel, although mostly in academic circles. But here's him being discussed in a newspaper like 100 years after his death in 1909. So these intellectuals, among others, gave this tribalism, the collectivism, the racism, this veneer of respectability. So what used to be this backwater in America turned into a mainstream position, and not only acceptable, but also desirable. In The Missing Link, Ayn Rand talks about how for a very long time, the tribalism was this backwater in America, that this view that some people held. But ultimately, people put the individuals above the tribe, and they ultimately decided that they wanted to venture into the world and deal with people as individuals. And then she said, the disintegration of philosophy reversed this trend. Tribalism is a product of fear, and fear is the dominant emotion of any person, culture, or society that rejects man's power of survival, reason. As philosophy slithered into the primitive swamp of irrationalism, men were driven existentially and psychologically into its primordial corollary, tribalism. So this is part of what happened with immigration. What was seen as this backwater, as this belief that some people held and that sometimes turned violent even, it became widespread and it became politically influential once and only once philosophy and intellectuals gave it this veneer of respectability. And a lot of people started adopting these ideas. These ideas were seen as respectable and intellectual. And people were discussing these ideas favorably in newspapers, in pamphlets, like everywhere. That pamphlet that says, "Who will be the mothers of coming America?" it discusses how the American woman is rapidly becoming ugly because of the immigrant mothers that were coming here, and they were ugly, among other things. So these ideas really penetrated the culture through the intellectuals, to the intellectual trend of racism and eugenics. Look at this postcard from 1910. Eugenic certificate, it reads, signed by an MD. This guarantees that I have examined the center of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. So at this point in America, for many people, it was popular, it was sophisticated, it was even cool and cute and romantic to be a racist. And again, to be clear, a lot of people rejected these ideas. A lot of people really opposed them. And we see that today, right? We see all this tribalism in immigration, but when Americans deal with immigrants one-on-one, like, they are much better, right? They don't see them as this collective. But these intellectuals that I mentioned earlier that were pushing the collectivism really made a lot of damage to America. That is the power of ideas. And in fact, it's the fault of these intellectuals that we started having these restrictions on immigration. And I know that it's a really bold claim to say, okay, these intellectuals are directly responsible for it. So I will tell you how I'm going to back up this claim. How much were intellectuals actually influencing legislation? So let me tell you about this guy, Harry Laughlin, who was an eugenicist who was instrumental in passing the 1924 law. He testified in front of the House Committee on Immigration, and he said that, quote, "The character of a nation is determined primarily by its racial qualities, that is, by the hereditary, physical, mental, and moral or temperamental traits of its people. We want to prevent any deterioration of the American people due to the immigration of inferior human stock." This guy was one of the architects of the 1924 law. But let's go even deeper. Let's look at the remarks from Senator Ellison Durant Smith in 1924. He was working on the law, who said, I quote, "I think we now have sufficient population in our country for us to shut the door and breed up a pure, unadulterated American citizenship. I would like for the members of the Senate to read that book just recently published by Madison Grant, The Passing of a Great Race. Thank God we have in America perhaps the largest percentage of any country in the world of the pure, unadulterated Anglo-Saxon stock, certainly the greatest of any nation in the Nordic breed." So this guy, Madison Grant, was an American eugenicist who had a lot of influence at the time, clearly because he was cited in Congress. But he had so much influence that Adolf Hitler referred to the passing of the great race as his Bible. his ideas, the ideas of Grant, directly influenced legislation to the point that one of the sponsors of the 1924 Act, Senator Johnson, read his book and was so impressed by the book that he wrote to Grant. And he asked them to help draft the bill. And so Grant helped draft the 1924 immigration law. So the author of Hitler's Bible helped draft immigration law in America. And who influenced Grant? People like Arthur de Gobineau and Chamberlain, and they were influenced by the collectivists of their time. And Grant was also influenced by the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer's, and you can sort of follow the philosopher chain of command there. And these collectivistic ideas were in full force in America. And it wasn't just a force that was affecting immigration policy, it was a force sweeping the entire nation. Because what else was happening at that point? Prohibition in 1920. Antitrust laws starting with the Sherman Act in 1890. The Federal Reserve Act, 1913, created the Fed. The Food and Drug Act of 1906 created the FDA. So the more that capitalism and individualism and freedom were attacked in America, the more restrictions that we start seeing in immigration. The way that Harry Binswanger put it in a meeting that we had about this, as individualism waned, restrictionists gain. Individualism was taking a hit in America. This tension, collectivism was winning. So, of course, there were good things happening in America at that point as well, right? We have, for instance, women's suffrage. But a lot of the bad institutions, the bad laws that we have today started at this point in American history. So this tension that we had since America's founding between individualism and collectivism got much more tense. The ideas of the Enlightenment that made possible the Declaration and the founding were the climax of this respect for reason and individualism. But these ideas never completely shrugged off the collectivism that was started by the anti-Enlightenment movement. And in the 19th century, there was a lot of individualism, but it was always susceptible to this impact of collectivism. And of course, we don't have these racist laws anymore. We have a system that's restrictive, but it's not based on eugenics, at least. So did things get better in immigration? Sort of. What happened was, in 1965, a new law was passed, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which repealed the 1924 law. And this law laid the framework for our system today, and essentially did away with the quotas, and it set a whole different system similar to what we have today. So this discrimination ended. And why was that? Well, what happened between, 1924 and 1965? The Holocaust, right? So people started seeing the consequences of the horrific ideas that they held. And also it's not a coincidence that this passed during the civil rights movement as well. But it only rejected one part of the tribalism, the racist part, but not the rest. Because what does our current immigration system based on this law do? It's like it grabbed the Chinese Exclusion Act and it applied it to everyone equally. Because remember what the Chinese Exclusion Act did. Chinese people cannot come here unless they fit into these narrow categories, and then they are permitted to come. That is what happens today. Everyone is excluded from America, except those that fit into very narrow categories that allow them to immigrate here. So I don't think that it's the fault of I guess it's not the fault of Trump and Coulter or those others. It's not essentially their tribalism that led us to where we are today. There's something deeper, something that gave tribalism the power to take over. It's the philosophy of collectivism that has, throughout history, given these ideas this veneer of respectability, this pretense of rationality. And some of these ideas have been rejected, but many of them are still with us today. So given everything I have told you today, I think there's good news and bad news. The good news is that, the bad news actually is that philosophical ideas can dramatically influence the policy and the future of the country, as they have. The good news is that philosophical ideas can dramatically influence policy and the future of this country. America is still the place that so many immigrants choose because this fight between collectivism and individualism is not lost. There is still so much individualism. There's still so many people like us who resist the pull of the tribalism and the collectivism. And I think the fact that America, under all of these attacks, hasn't, sunk into the deepest collectivism says a lot about America's founding principles and ideals. And just like we oppose all these regulations that started in the 20th century, like antitrust, like prohibition, like the income tax, and the regulatory state more broadly, I think we should all be opposed to these restrictions on immigration as well. And I hope that today I have showed you that the origins of these restrictions go hand in hand with the broader attack of freedom in America, and that they are a product of collectivism. A free country cannot have the restrictions on immigrations that we have, or any, really. Because remember, like one of my favorite immigration scholars says, every restriction on immigration is also a restriction on native-born Americans. So when we fight for individualism, let's not relegate immigration. I think immigration is a crucial part of fighting for individualism. And it's one of the restrictions on immigration is one of the biggest evils that collectivism has brought to this country. Thank you.